Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Moushabeck, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2025 Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual festival day. I join you from Massachusetts at Interlink Publishing, the only Palestinian-owned publisher in the United States, which was established in Brooklyn in 1987 by my parents. Unfortunately, Pankaj Mishra, the author of The World After Gaza, is not able to make it to the panel today. But I'm thrilled to welcome three other incredible writers. Omar El Akkad, longtime journalist and author of One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, which was just longlisted for the National Book Award, joins us from Portland, Oregon. Sada Aziza, a Palestinian-American writer, translator, and Fulbright Fellow, whose debut memoir, The Hollow Half, published in April, is joining us from New York. And Ahmed Alnaouq, a journalist and director of We Are Not Numbers, as well as co-editor of the recently released anthology of the same name, joins us from London. I want to let attendees know that books by authors in this program can be purchased through the links in the chat. Purchasing these books supports the authors and the festival, which makes programming like this possible. Before we start the panel, I want to address the conflict of speaking about Gaza from the center of the imperial core, whilst our governments contribute financially and politically to the murder and displacement of 2.5 million Palestinians. According to a newly released academic study by Dr. Richard Hill and Dr. Gideon Polya, the estimated death toll in Gaza is now 680,000, over which half are children under the age of 5. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us, particularly Sada and Ahmed, whose families have been personally impacted by the genocide. Thank you so much and welcome. To start off our conversation, I would like each of you to talk about the titles of your books. These are really evocative titles, and I would love to learn about the significance of the title and what you hope readers will take away. And let's start with Ahmed.
Hello, Hannah, and thank you very much for having me today. Well, I think the title of our book says all the story. We are not numbers, and we decided to call it "We Are Not Numbers" because for too long, for many, many, many years, the Palestinians, unfortunately, they have been reduced to numbers. Every time we hear about, every time there is a bloodshed in Palestine, every time there is a war, a genocide in Gaza, we mainly hear the statistics about people who were killed, who were injured, numbers of houses were destroyed, and all of that. But we are not numbers. We wanted to give voice to the Palestinians, to the people who have endured this genocide, this conflict, this occupation. So we are not numbers. The Voices of Gaza Youth it is a collection of 74 stories that are written not by experts, not by people who studied or researched the conflict, but people who lived and breathed the air of Palestine, who lived and breathed the air of the Gaza Strip. Some of these writers were killed. Four of our writers were killed during this genocide. Many, many of our writers lost their loved ones. Many of our writers lost their families. Most of our writers who are from Gaza lost their houses. And they are here to tell their personal stories to the world in a language that the world understands. So it's 74 stories written by 59 Palestinians. Most of these writers are young people who have lived their entire life in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you. Sada?
Hi, thank you everyone for joining. It's really an honor to be here with you, Hannah, with you, Ahmed, with you, Omar. Regarding the title of my book, I am a diaspora Palestinian. My family comes from Gaza, but I was born in the United States and raised between the Midwest and the Gulf. So the title, The Hollow Half, really speaks to the starting point of the story, which is a very personal one. one of sort of like split identities between between my Palestinian history and land and the experience of being trapped outside and cut off in many ways from my history through processes of assimilation, trauma, and the forgetting that comes with trying to survive trauma. And the book is really an excavation of my family's personal history. It centers a lot around my Sittu, who survived the Nakba, then lived in Gaza, and then was dispelled in 1967. And then my father's story layered over that. And the hollowness in the title really evokes the hollowness of this idea of leaving behind, of being half Palestinian, half something else, being trapped in this sort of lesser state of one's Palestinian identity. And it's a coming home in many ways to the fullness of the Palestinian experience, which involves both a lot of pain and a lot of love, and sort of with the consideration of the call that this love brings us to resist and to work towards full Palestinian liberation.
I love that. Thank you. Ahmed?
Thank you so much for doing this, Hannah. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and to be with these two brilliant writers. The original title for the book was The Glass Coffin. When I was writing it through the first draft, I was thinking about this idea that in situations of great asymmetric violence and occupation and degradation, one of the most offensive things the person on the receiving end of that degradation can do in the eyes of the empire is simply show the body, simply show what is happening. And this, I think, speaks a little bit to what Ahmed was talking about, this notion that a huge component of subjugation and dehumanization is to present a people as existing exclusively in aggregate. I remember doing this one event with Air Force cadets. I don't know why I signed on to this thing, but I did. It was a short story collection that was going to be presented. Anyway, and the panel was on September 11th. It was on that day. And so it began with this presentation with a slideshow with a bunch of numbers. And there was a very specific number at the top. And it said, number of people killed on September 11th. And then there was a range, like 600,000 to 900,000. And it was like number of Iraqis killed in the subsequent. And that idea of just these people don't exist as individuals. They're not actually human beings. They're a murmuration. They're a movement that is stripped of something essentially human. So that's what I was thinking about. It was only after the book was written, and when I was in the second or third draft, that an editor suggested that I repurpose something that I had tweeted out months earlier. And that's where this title comes from. I've realized now that a lot of people have read it quite literally. And obviously, there are many people who will never have been against this. There are gleeful genocide supporters who will be till the end of their lives. And the vast majority of the earth is against this right now. But the title refers to, I think, a very particular kind of mainstream progressive liberal. In the same way, you can't find one of those folks who will tell you that they used to be in favor of South African apartheid or segregation in the US. One day it will come along that it will be impolite for someone in that ideological sphere to not have always been against this. So that's where that title comes from.
Donna, you pay tribute to countless writers in your memoir, The Hollow Half, even dedicating an entire part to excerpts of writing. In fact, many Interlink books are mentioned, which I had to underline and really I had to nerd out about. I was so proud. Can you speak more about sort of why you did this, and maybe you can share, and I know this is the worst question to ask, but maybe there's one Palestinian book or author that you think people really need to read that's essential.
Wow. Okay. That last question is a tough one, but I will.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It probably depends on it. It's a good problem to have. But yeah, thank you for gesturing towards that. There are two systems of annotations in my book, which is not as hairy as it sounds. It's actually, I tried to streamline it a lot. Most of the footnotes are at the end in a section I call Diwan, which in Arabic tradition is sort of a gathering place, a place to discuss, to come together as a community to settle disputes. So I interwove a lot of allusions to Palestinian writers, as well as many like Black radical thinkers, Indigenous authors, feminist thinkers, you know, examples from the Latin American resistance movement. So just I couldn't imagine living, creating, writing, telling a story, even a very personal story, without bringing in so many of, you know, the book in many ways is about ancestors, and our ancestors are not just our blood relatives. They are the people that teach us how to think, how to survive. And I really wanted to not only pay homage to all of these writers and thinkers, but also open up the canon, challenge the canon that many Anglophone readers come to the book with. I wanted to sort of create the first tracings of a map that maybe other readers might want to go and fill in further themselves. So some of the writers might be familiar to people who have a passing knowledge of Palestine, like Mahmoud Darwish. Get a little bit like more specific. There's Marid Barghouti, who's a very important author to me. And, you know, and then there's also quotations from my father, from more, you know, lay people who would be considered less prominent. Because I also, again, there's this horizontality, if that's a word, that I wanted to model, because I also think that the single story, the linear individual hero's journey is such a Western model. And I was trying to break that and challenge that, because again, this book is about my personal survival through mental health challenges that bring me back to intergenerational stories, which ended up tracing me back to the broader sweep of history. My story, my survival, my days, my hours are not ever individual. So I was trying to find ways in the flat, you know, plane of the page to do that. So that's where, again, all of those voices come in. And to answer the final question, I would say just today, I think that I'll pick someone that maybe fewer people have heard of, Bassel El-Araj, who was a Palestinian young man who wrote beautifully, hauntingly about resistance, and resistance that was completely drenched in love for his people and a belief in a radical imagination for their liberation. And he was killed very young. And we can read the letter that he wrote, much like many of our martyrs from this genocide, who wrote letters to be published after their death. Like Anas al-Sharif, for example. It's a whole canon of Palestinian writing, right? These posthumous goodbye letters. So Basel's is beautiful. It's one of the last quotes in my book. And if you've never encountered Bassel El-Araj, I'm sorry, I would encourage you to seek him out. Yeah.
Amazing. Omar, your book confronts Western propaganda and the media's role in this genocide. Over the course of working on your book, have you seen any shift in media bias? And even, you know, since you've been on the road, do you see a future shift? You know, your title sort of teases a promise, perhaps, of a time when there will be a shift. But I would love to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the most simultaneously inspiring and depressing thing is that there has been a shift. And it's, you know, like, to give you an example, last summer I was asked by the op-eds editor of my previous newspaper, the place I used to work. He asked me to write an editorial, and I said, listen, I don't want to waste your time. You're not going to run this thing, because I'm going to call it a genocide, and I'm going to say that Western governments are complicit. And this guy who's a friend of mine wrote back saying, yeah, you're right. And then in January, same guy, same paper, asked me to write an op-ed, and I said, listen, I don't want to waste your time. You're not going to run this, because I'm going to call it a genocide, and I'm going to say Western governments are complicit. And he said, yeah, go for it. So
Wow.
immediately I started thinking, you know, what has changed, right? The cynical part of me thinks, okay, enough brown bodies have piled up that you've been forced into this position, right? And to be perfectly honest, I know this sounds crass, but one of the most clarifying things about the last 2 years has been knowing the exchange rate, being made to know the exchange rate, right? And there have been many times in my life where I've been introduced to this exchange rate, going to Afghanistan, seeing that at NATO airfields, at the forward operating bases, the soldiers stationed on the outside lines where all the attacks are going to happen are without exception the Afghanistani soldiers. The NATO soldiers are in the back. And once we're done sort of killing the people who matter less, then maybe. And so it has been incredibly educational in that regard. And I think if I was a less naive or less spineless person, I would have come to these conclusions much earlier. In fact, virtually every conclusion in that book. But it has been a very clarifying experience to see that. I think a big part of it is that if you are a journalist, you are in the business of knowing things, of understanding how things work. And I think almost every journalist who has covered this subject matter knows exactly what is happening. They've known for years, there's nothing surprising about any of this, but they also know the asymmetry of consequences. There is a huge, huge difference between getting yelled at on Twitter and having your career demolished, right? And so I think the asymmetry of consequence is still there, but the amount of rage at the severity of the bias, right? Some people are killed and some people just collide with bullets as though they were walking in the street and a bullet just bumped into them. Some hospitals are bombed and we know who bombed them. And some hospitals just disappear into thin air. And I think the flagrant nature of this has gotten to be at such a magnitude that the pushback is starting to cause a change. But that change is glacial. And to see it happen, you know, the pragmatic side of me thinks anything that causes a change in this bias is a good thing. But then there's another part of me that thinks, now I know the score, right? Now I know exactly how this works. And I should have known much earlier, given that I worked in this industry. But yes, there has been a change. And it's been forced almost entirely by the amount of rage at just how bad the journalism in this part of the world has been.
Ahmed, you recently went viral by challenging journalists for their biased coverage. Can you share a little bit about that experience and what was said?
Yeah, I think, well, at the beginning of this genocide, Israel bombed my home and they killed most of my family members. I lost 21 members of my family, including my father, my brothers, my sisters, and 14 nieces and nephews of mine and a cousin. And 21 members were killed in just 1 second. But after that and before that, I lost many, many, many other family members. And the only reason I survived this genocide is because I wasn't in Gaza. If I were in Gaza at that time, I would have been killed with my family. But I have been living in the UK for the past 6 years, and the first time I was ever invited to speak at the ministry media is when I lost my family. So the price was losing 21 members of your family to be invited to speak at the BBC or Sky News and other media publications. But still, when I was there, when I was invited by the ministry media, I was always interrogated, investigated. I was introduced as someone as Ahmed who lost 21 members of his family, you know. And at other places, I was told that my family members, my nieces and nephews, the kids who were slaughtered at my home were collateral damage, and I was yelled at for questioning the neutrality and the unbiased of the mainstream media when I talked about Palestine. So unfortunately, we have been used to this kind of a treatment for the Palestinians. And that's why we started We Are Not Numbers 10 years ago. We started We Are Not Numbers after Israel killed my brother in the war in 2014. And that was the first time I ever lose a family member. And I was crushed at that time. I was crushed because I lost a family member, but I was also crushed because at that time Israel killed 2,000 Palestinians and they were mentioned in the media as numbers, as terrorists. And that's why we started We Are Not Numbers, because we wanted to challenge the mainstream media narrative on Palestine. We Palestinians, we do not have to lose 21 family of our members to be interviewed by the mainstream media. And after we lose family members, after we watch our country, our beloved city being decimated in front of our eyes, we don't want to be investigated in the mainstream media. We don't want to be interrogated. We don't want to be asked uncomfortable questions. We need a platform. We need these platforms to give us a comfortable, safe space to speak in memory of our loved family. But it never ends, unfortunately. It never ends. And as Omar said, yes, there is a change in the mainstream media, a little bit of a change, but at what a price? The price was a genocide in Gaza. A price was the total dissemination of an entire city, of entire population. And unfortunately, a little bit of a change has happened, but it's not enough, and it's too late.
Dada, your cousin is in Gaza and you've been translating some of his poetry. Can you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I have a lot of cousins, family members in Gaza. Specifically, I think you're referring to Nabil, who's in his late 20s. He was a pharmacist, is a pharmacist, loved his job, loves Shakespeare, loves to write romantic stories. And yeah, he's just a wonderful person, so full of life. And actually never really considered himself a poet or a writer, but he was sending me these letters from the very beginning that were so, they were like these really poetic sort of dreamscape, horrorscape, little apertures into the daily experiences of the genocide. And similar in a very small way to Ahmed's vision, I'm grateful for the platform I have. I write as much as I can. I try to do right by you know, what I can do as a writer here in the West. But it's so much more important to me that we hear from people in Gaza, particularly. So yeah, I've translated a little bit of his work. I'm working on a couple other translations by some other amazing young writers in Gaza for some other projects, and it's such a privilege. It's also devastating. It's also devastating to just handle these treasures and at any moment know that there's nothing I can do to protect these writers, that every moment I stand in awe of the beauty or the depth of their hearts and the light and the scope of their dreams, knowing that as I'm typing, those could be cut short, those could be taken from us forever. And also feeling a little bit of bitterness and tension about translating them, because I don't think English deserves them. And I don't think American readers necessarily, most of them deserve them. I do know that Nabil loves having his stories shared, so that is why I continue to do it. For a long time, I wouldn't share about my family because I didn't want to practice that appeal towards empathy that many of us are asked to do day in and day out. Like Ahmed said, be put in the interrogation chair before we're allowed to even grieve publicly for our families. We have to validate that they weren't terrorists in whatever definition of the word of this term that the person across from us decides to apply to us. So I decided to completely like opt out of that for a long time and just keep my family, like the most precious things I feel like should be kept private in some ways, despite living in this ecosystem that like pushes us to expose ourselves and sometimes does move needles, sometimes does, you know, so many people have been brought in through people's courageous storytelling, specifically people on the ground in Gaza. So participating in translation always feels like a tension, but because currently these writers do desire to have their stories shared, I defer to them. And again, everything we do feels like the least we could do and less, but we do it. So I'm grateful for that.
Me too. Ahmed, you started to talk a little bit about We Are Not Numbers, but could you explain, you know, what the organization does, and also, you know, has been doing for the last 10 years, and how you all decided to select certain pieces and also the format of the anthology?
Yes, so We Are Not Numbers started after the war in 2014, in which I lost my brother. And then an American journalist, her name is Pam Bailey, she encouraged me to write a story about my brother. And at first I refused to write a story about my brother because I thought no one cares about the Palestinians. No one wants to read the stories of the Palestinians, especially in English, especially in the West. But then she insisted, and I was embarrassed. I did not say no. So I wrote my first story about my brother who was killed in that war. So my English was very bad at that time. So she helped me edit the story, and then we published the story online. And then for the first time, I started to receive messages and emails of people who never knew me. And they told me that they read my story, they were moved by it, and they encouraged me to keep on writing. Surprisingly, the process of writing a story was therapeutic to me at that time. I was severely depressed. And then I thought, okay, maybe we should write our stories. Maybe we need to tell the world what really happens in Gaza, to share the stories of the Palestinians with the world. And then we decided to replicate this experience with so many other Palestinians. So we created this platform, and we started with the training of 20 writers from Gaza on how to write their stories, educate them a little bit about human rights, international law, how to approach the Western audiences. And then after that, we would link each of these writers with an international mentor to help them like work in their stories. And then we published these stories. So we started in 2015, in February 2015. Each 6 months, we will train another cohort of writers. We started, of course, from Gaza, and then we expanded to include all Palestinians, all young Palestinians, whether they were in Gaza, the West Bank, and the Palestinian diaspora all around the world. So far, we published more than 17 or 1,800 stories. And by the way, these stories are not only stories of a tragedy and pain and suffering and lost loved ones. These are stories, we encourage our writers to write stories that tell the story of Palestine. Stories of love, stories of talent, stories of history, of civilization, of the characteristics of the Palestinians, everything that you need to know about Palestine, and especially about Gaza. You will find the stories from We Are Not Numbers that talk specifically about this topic. And we have trained more than 400 writers now. And I'm to be honest, I'm very surprised. I never knew that the Palestinians in Gaza could be so talented, but they're very talented, they're very resilient, they're very powerful, that even in midst of the genocide, our writers from Gaza wrote their stories, they wrote their poems, they wrote their pieces, and they shared it with the world. During the genocide, during the past 22 months, we have written hundreds of stories, even more than we used to publish before the genocide in Gaza. And then finally, we decided to put some of these stories in one book so that it could reach wider audiences. And I don't know, I believe Sarah was one of our mentors, no? Yeah. So
Amazing.
yeah, thank you. So yeah, this is what we have been doing, and I'm very impressed by the resilience and power of these Palestinians, of these young Palestinians in Gaza, and they will continue to inspire the world.
I couldn't agree more. So all of us have been in the literary industry for quite some time, and we've experienced the repression of Palestinian voices and those who stand for Palestinians. And, there are spaces where the industry has, amplified our voices, like Brooklyn Book Fest and this amazing panel. But more commonly than not, there's also an incredible amount of suppression that's happening here, not just within the publishing industry, but the media landscape as a whole. I would love to hear more about your individual experiences with that. I know, Amar, I know that several of your events have been canceled due to, security threats. I'm sure all of us have experienced that. Do you see there being a shift? Do you see that changing? And what have been some successful ways in which you've circumnavigated that? Amar, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah, and I should say that relative to the experiences of folks that I've talked to, who are maybe at a different stage of their career or at an earlier stage of their career, I've suffered absolutely nothing. I mean, there are lots of writers, especially new and young writers, who made the mistake of having a moral compass and standing up for what they believe in too early. And their careers have been wrecked. I mean, absolutely wrecked. And I was lucky enough that I had something of an established track record. I was in that actually perfect space where I'm not Margaret Atwood, so it's not like the things I say are making the kind of headlines that'll cause that pushback, but I had enough of a track record that was harder to sort of shut me down. That's just a function of luck more than anything else. But I remember going to the first meeting we had about this manuscript, which was in February of last year, going to the Penguin Random House offices in New York, and sitting in that room with a bunch of senior editors, and there being a real tension and a real sort of anxiety in that room about what I genuinely believe, if it's going to be remembered at all, will be remembered as the tamest book, and yet nonetheless in that room, there was a real something approaching fear. And if it wasn't for my editor specifically fighting tooth and nail and carrying his entire track record in and leveraging it, that thing never gets bought, right? There's that famous story that I think every Arab writer in the US knows now about Edward Said going around in the 80s trying to get the work of Naguib Mahfouz translated, and all the editors of the major publishing houses shutting him down, and him eventually saying, like, this is good work. Why, and one of these publishers saying, yeah, it's good work, but Arabic is a controversial language. And I keep thinking about that, right? Because there's something very, very instructive about that. There is still, I think, this mode now through which the publishing industry is at least trying to navigate the immense cost to the soul of staying silent about this while maintaining a distance from controversy. So if you go to the Penguin Random House description of my book, for example, the word genocide doesn't appear anywhere. I haven't read the description of this panel. I would not be surprised if the word genocide doesn't appear. And that's not fine, you do whatever the hell you want. But I think there's, particularly with the literary festivals I've dealt with cultural organizations, there is this sense of, okay, the magnitude of the horror is so large that we can't possibly ignore it. What we're going to do is try to maintain this neutrality where we afford a platform. We don't take any political statements, but we afford a platform. And the response is always, no, you take political positions all of the time. You take them all of the time when you feel that it's safe enough, and so on and so forth. There's been some shift, but the fear is still there, and it's just much, much easier not to publish these books than to publish them and hope that they gain enough traction to offset the shit that you're going to get in response.
Dada?
It's an interesting question for me, because I think before the genocide, the genocide's been going on for like a century, if you want to measure it, from the beginning of Zionism, which is a genocidal project. But since before October 7th, I went to journalism school. I have a master's in journalism. I was working straightforwardly as a journalist for a while. And I was also a Palestine activist on my campus. I write about it in my book, but I think some of the most brutal repression I faced was actually as a student activist. It was a very punishing and disciplining experience, and I was reeling for a couple of years after that. I got to the point I even was physically assaulted by a Zionist student. So I was really rattled and afraid, honestly, and I'm ashamed to admit, because as Omar says, nothing a cost to our career is not a cost compared to what we're facing as Palestinians and as specifically in Gaza. But I was really trying to figure out, as one of those not yet established writers, what can I afford? Such a, problematic way to frame it. But yeah, I was a little bit at a loss. I focused for a while writing about Yemen, Syria, Iraq, other places. But when I finally realized there's no way I can conscience not writing openly, outspokenly, uncompromisingly about Palestine, I guess I made the decision then that I wouldn't expect the New York Times to come calling, that I wouldn't expect a Big Five book deal, that I wouldn't expect any of those things that I'm taught in journalism school and just by society to mark as success. I'm really, really grateful because I'm one of the few people who didn't lose that much career-wise or friendship-wise after October 7th, because I think I'd set up the community and the career track that was compatible with what I was wanting to say before and after October 7th. But it also, I do feel it sometimes, and I do wrestle with it still, knowing there are certain things that just probably won't come my way. Certain awards, certain reviews, certain headline, like bylines. Selling my book, I faced a lot of, those meetings happened without me, Omar. They got together and said no. I had a lot of warm rejections. People saying they love the writing, they love the story, but the market, readers, American audiences, etc. And I'm very lucky that I found one editor who believed in the book, and I sold the book before October 7th, and I pushed it even further, like just politically and craft-wise, once this was underway, realizing again that in the face of this annihilation, in the face of this horror, the only answer through love is to, resist more directly and in English and Arabic, whatever we have at our fingertips. So again, I was grateful that I was with the editor and with the publishing house that like empowered me to do that. So I guess there's also a route where you sort of avoid some of these things by setting yourself up in the places and among the people that won't try to shut you down or harm you for speaking the truth and speaking with a conscience.
I love that. That's really smart. Ahmed, what has been the reception for your book? I know you're in the UK, but it's just released here in the US.
Yeah, so the reception we received here in the UK is amazing. The publisher in the UK is not Interlink, unfortunately. The publisher is Win, and they have been doing really wonderful work here in the UK. But also, I think it's because it's such a powerful book. It has received a lot of attention. It's a bestseller in the UK. It's a Sunday Times bestseller. It is the Irish Times bestseller as well. I have this habit whenever I walk the streets, I would whenever I pass by any bookshop, I would go and search for We Are Not Numbers, and it's always there in the front of any bookshop I go to. I've been doing a lot of events about this book, tons of events all across the country and even outside this country. The reception is amazing. People love this book. A lot of people, when they read this book, they cry and they send me these messages and emails and they tell me how wonderful this book is. And this is not my book. This is a book of, as I said, 59 Palestinian writers. So far, we translated this book to Italian and it's out there in Italy. We also got deals to have Japanese and Arabic versions of We Are Not Numbers. So it's really doing well. And I think it will be translated into many other languages. And I believe it deserves a translation. It deserves to be there. It deserves to be on every bookshelf in the world because these stories need to be heard. But I'm still new to this books world. This is my first book. And yeah, I don't have much experience outside of this book, unfortunately.
Well, inshallah, we can bring you to the US one day and people can meet you. We just have a few minutes left. So to end quickly, I would like to ask each of you to share a call to action for audience members who want to support those in Gaza, whether it's reading books or donating to a certain organization. If we could just go through, Amar, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. With the caveat that I absolutely defer to my co-panelists on this. My mantra these days has been that nothing is enough and everything matters. Everything feels so futile, and yet you do it anyway. On the most basic front, to give whatever resources you can to the people doing the actual work. God knows I'm not doing a damn thing, but the Samir Project is. Look them up. Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta goes down and does reconstructive surgery on the children who have borne the brunt of this genocide. If you are worried about smaller groups or if you don't want to go to Gaza funds, The PCRF is doing medical aid for Palestinians in the UK. There's lots of groups that are doing the work in spite of incredible, incredible obstacles put up, essentially to keep people getting killed. That's the reason those obstacles exist, the sole reason. Write to your elected representatives, even though they don't read those letters. Call them, even though they don't care about the phone calls. The aggregate effect. These people function in a world of complete self-preservation. And if those numbers climb high enough, it starts to affect their sense of self-preservation. The overarching thing I would say is decide how troublesome you want to be about this, because it's going to affect every facet of your life. There are many of us who have decided at one point that when we're sitting at the dinner table and somebody says a comment about trans folks, that for years we had maybe would have just let it pass, and we've decided we're going to stop doing that. Figure out how troublesome you are going to be about an ongoing genocide. Because ultimately, you don't have to have a conversation with me or anybody else. You have to have that conversation with yourself, and that is going to last for the rest of your life. So figure out where you stand on that. And I'll shut up with that thing.
Thank you. Ahmed?
So when Israel killed my family in October 2023, I said that Israel, yes, pulled the trigger. Israel killed my family, but Israel would have never been able to kill my family without the support, without the coverage of the mainstream media. So the mainstream media hasn't been only biased to Israel, but they have been instrumental in killing and enabling the genocide that's taken place in Gaza. And my call and my call for action for people who are watching us: boycott the mainstream media. It is time that we boycott the mainstream media, and it is time to empower the Palestinian media and the alternative media. Because if we keep criticizing the mainstream media from now until the end of time, it will not make a positive outcome. We need to start building our own alternative media, and we need to start empowering our alternative media. And that's why I encourage people to support We Are Not Numbers, to support Palestine Deep Dive, to support the other independent publishers, Interlink, and those who give a platform for the Palestinians to tell their stories.
Thank you. And Sada?
Sure. I endorse both of these, all of the suggestions of the preceding panelists. To underscore what Ahmed just said, I think that's kind of what I was gesturing towards in my last answer. We need to build up the alternatives. I have no problem with, criticizing the mainstream media and pushing them, but it's moving too slowly. And I don't know necessarily if they deserve as much energy as we're putting into that, where we could be building out. Again, we have so many Palestinians. Basically, let's just cut to the chase. Believe Palestinians, listen to Palestinians. You cited that study at the top, the 680,000 people that are estimated to have died. Susan Abul Hawa, among other people last summer, were projecting that it could be above 500,000. So that was last year, early summer. But because it's Palestinians, because it's independent sources, because it doesn't agree with the mainstream momentum of the narrative that people feel comfortable believing, because it has symmetry with past wars in the Middle East and the way we've been taught to think about these things, it was ignored. And here we are. And it doesn't do much good to eventually come around to the correct number when it's too late to stop it. And I do think that has a lot to do with when people wake up to certain things. When 2 million people are on the verge of famine, suddenly people want to bang pots. But we've had all of the information, we've had all the numbers, we've had them from the mouths of the Israeli generals from the first week saying we're going to starve these people to death, they're animals. We don't need any more information, and we don't need to convince the mainstream. Like we are empowered to know what's going on and to decide what we're going to do. As Omar said, there are ideas of strategy. What will work? I think arms embargoes, there's grassroots momentum towards pushing towards your local campaigns to participate in arms embargoes. Find out if there are arms like manufacturers or docks near you where you can organize locally to stop the weapons. That's extremely important. Donating constantly, individuals and organizations other people have named. Those are questions of strategy. And then there's also the questions of personal ethics. You can boycott the New York Times because they are whitewashing a genocide, not necessarily because the New York Times will notice, but because you know what you stand by and how you want to live. And if enough of us do that, things will also change that way. So it is all hands on deck, and it has been for all of us who love Palestinians. It's always been this. And as my friend Fargo Tabaki says, you have to change your life. So I think that's something that challenges me every day, and I'm not ever finished answering it.
Thank you all so much. It has been such an honor to share this space with you. To all of our audience members listening, please remember you can order all of these incredible writers' books through the link in the chat. Consider making a donation after Palestine Orgs to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 20th year presenting free literary programming. If you can catch the festival in person, from today for the next 9 days, there will be Brooklyn Book Fest events, including citywide bookend events, festivals, in-person Children's Day and Festival Day, which take place on September 20th and 21st in downtown Brooklyn. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the Brooklyn Book Fest for giving us this platform, and thank you all so much to the writers in the room. It's been such an honor.